Hey everybody, what's going on? Hellmite here, bringing you another video from Grab the Lantern today. I wish you guys all a very happy Wild Rift launch day, and I hope a lot of you guys are tearing it up out there on your mobile devices, but that's not what we're going to be talking about today, as I've previously talked about Wild Rift and what it kind of means for the future of League of Legends in a previous video that I've done, which I will have linked down in the description below if you guys are interested in taking a look at that. Today, instead, I wanted to talk about why Riot doesn't do VGUs anymore, as I feel like that is a topic that's kind of come up, especially given that Riot have recently, or not so recently, announced that the Udyr VGU will not be coming out until next year. That's right, a bunch of pipeline things got thrown off. I don't think we're surprised at all, especially given the state of the world and everything going on, but suffice it to say, Udyr's visual update is not going to be happening until 2022, and that means there will be an entire year with no updated champions no updated existing champions, just a bunch of new ones. And given that a lot of people were slightly disappointed with Gwen's visual design, myself included, I think it makes a lot of sense to say that people are a little disappointed to hear that news. Obviously, new releases are really good, but players who are mostly just excited for their favorite champions' new appearances are quite sad about this. And a lot of people have then kind of brought up the concept of visual updates as opposed to visual and gameplay updates. That is what VGU stands for, in case you were curious. Now, back in the day, Riot did VUs, visual updates, where all they did is basically take a look at an older champion and update their visual appearance. That is essentially it. They basically just modernized the champion, made them look like they belonged to the game that they were supposedly a part of, replace their old crappy model and rig with some new fancier models and rigs and particle effects, usually at the same time, and they usually didn't touch anything about the champion kit. Sometimes it was very small changes, but generally speaking, nothing about the champion's kit actually changed, and it was all visual. A lot of players, therefore, have sort of asked, why doesn't Riot do more of these? These make a lot of sense for Riot to do. They feel like it takes a lot of less effort than just doing a full VGU, right? If all you're doing is just updating the champion's kit design, and especially it would allow Riot to focus on some champions who may have stronger kits, but may not necessarily have very good visuals. So why don't Riot do these anymore? Now, to answer that, it's sort of a multifaceted question, but suffice to say, it essentially isn't worth Riot's time. And let me go ahead and explain. Generally, gameplay is Riot's priority number one. They need to make sure that League of Legends plays as well as it possibly can in any situation. That means that things like clarity, good play patterns, power level, all of those are super huge concerns that Riot will always be focusing on. And that means that Riot will therefore be focusing mostly on champions with bad kits. Champions that are under or overpowered, if they have poor play patterns, if they have bad things for clarity, if they lack counterplay, right? Those are the kinds of things that Riot are going to be looking at and essentially saying, hey, we need to make sure that these things are good to go on that champion to start off with. We don't want to, jump the bullet and focus on a champion that has good gameplay just for the sake of visual updates. So this means that while champions like Leona or Caitlyn have super dated models but very good gameplay, they're not going to be very high priority for VGUs for quite some time because they have good gameplay, and as we've just established, that's the first priority for Riot Games. And it makes sense. League of Legends needs to play well. That's the reason why most of us are still around. Obviously, some players got into League of Legends for the characters or story or world, and that's a totally valid thing to do, or maybe they started playing the game initially for the game and then got engaged with the lore and the story and the characters. But either way, generally speaking, the gameplay is the most important thing about League of Legends. I would hazard a guess that over 75% of the people who play League know nothing about the characters or the story or anything whatsoever and are only here for the gameplay. So in that regard, it doesn't make sense to be focusing on anything other than the gameplay to make sure that that stands out. Now, some would argue that we've gotten out of the territory of champions with bad kits, that a lot of the champions from here on out that are being reworked not necessarily because their kits are terrible, but because maybe they're missing in thematic grounds, or maybe they could just stand up to their fantasy a little bit better. And I would say that, yeah, that's totally the case. Gone are the days of champions like old Urgot or old Yorick or Xerath, who really needed a visual and gameplay update in order to actually have good gameplay and live up to those gameplay qualities that I was just talking about. And while you'd be totally right that those champions don't exist anymore, Riot are still going to be focusing on champions that have issues with their thematic cohesion or fantasy, because in a game of 150 champions, you want to make sure each of your releases has a reason to exist and is living up to their theme. It would feel really bad for a new player to join League of Legends and say, oh cool, a half dragon, I'm really excited to see what this character actually does, and then be disappointed that Shyvana, as opposed to ripping enemies asunder with her claws and fangs, is instead going to throw a fireball at them that does half the enemy's HP and then runs away and waits for it to come off of cooldown, right? Those are kind of disappointing. So those sorts of champions are better opportunities, which again means that champions that have solid gameplay hooks like Caitlyn, who even though her appearance is super dated, at the very least she lives up to her theme. You see Caitlyn, you say sniper, sheriff, lady, and that's totally what she does. She plays well, she has good clarity, she has a good theme. There's no reason to get to her visual update because essentially the gameplay isn't quite there. And so then the question becomes, why is the gameplay aspect so much easier to do than the visual aspect, right? If the things are one-to-one, then you should be able to start from either direction and then do the other one as you get there. And that's sort of not really the case, unfortunately. The biggest problem is while it's tempting to say, to point to one thing out of 100 and say, well, just doing that one thing would be easy to do, it doesn't take into account what that one thing would require. So while it can be very simple to say, well, Leona is just one champion, think about all of the things that we would have to do in order to visually update Leona. And this is not to talk about kit design at all, right? If Riot decided to, they could look at her kit and decide if there were any things that they could possibly change while they were doing this along the line, which would be a little bit more work, but generally the visual bottleneck is what we're talking about here. First of all, viewing Leona would require a new model for her. So, and this is just counting for her base. New textures, a new rig, new animations, and new particle effects for just her default appearance. She would also need new particle effects for every 1350 or higher skin that she has. She would also need a new model for every 1350 or higher skin that she has, as that's something that you get at that tier. New textures for every single one of her skins, potentially new sound design, and just generally, think about all of those things that are just Leona in-game. This isn't even taking into account things like Leona's splash arts. Every single one of her skins would have to get a new splash art, which, as you guys can tell by the general high-quality art that League of Legends has, is not something as simple as opening up MS Paint, doing a quick doodle, and slapping it together, right? These are these are artworks that basically people are slaving over for probably, I would guess, a couple of months, trying to make sure that they are as good as possible. So, and that's just one champion. And essentially the issue is that while you're going through all of this work at the same time, Riot also delve into a champion's appearance to make sure that they can tell as much as a story as possible with the character's design and tie them into the world more heavily than they were before, right? So again, using Leona as an example, it's not a simple question of taking Leona's base design and just sprucing it up, making it look prettier, updating her rig and saying, okay, we're good. If they were going to do Leona, they would want to make sure that she's tied harder into the Solari, probably use a lot more of the Solari iconography that they've sort of developed alongside things like Wild Rift. They would try to update her armor, update her sword and shield, all of these sorts of things while they were updating Leona. And these sorts of things take time to be hashed out, right? It's not as simple as saying, well, let's just pull up a design that we had on hand, right? A lot of it's sort of people meeting together and saying, here's what we can change, what works, what doesn't work, what can we change, how can we reinforce Leona as this Solari leader, all while maintaining things like gameplay clarity and champion theme clarity, and especially a champion's role, right? No matter what happens to Leona, right, have to make sure that she reads as a tank. So things like reducing the amount of armor she has, for example, are totally off the table. So how do you design her to make her more bulky, right? Which then builds out your timeline a little bit. So again, there are a lot of changes that you would have to work on, whereas kit design, for example, is a lot more simple. It requires a lot of iteration, but a lot of work can be done without needing to go through the whole shebang of a VU. If we think about Diana's mini rework a few months back, while she got updated particle effects, which is something that Riot does semi-regularly, if you think about Hecarim, for example, who recently got new particles for better gameplay clarity, then she was able to have her gameplay issues fixed without having to take the entire champion back into the lab. They didn't even have to get new animation or rigging support. Literally, all they did is tap a couple of VFX artists on the shoulder and say, hey, we're swapping up Diana's E and R, so change the essential sound weight of these abilities to better match what we're going for here, to make sure that the gameplay clarity of these new abilities is going to read well, and we'll go from there, right? So they didn't ever have to talk to a splash artist, a rigger, an animator, a modeler, anyone who does texture art. None of that had to change at all while they were doing Diana's new kit rework, right? So just looking at it from a gameplay perspective, it's a lot easier for Riot to do just gameplay than it is for them to do the full visual. So unfortunately, visual design is the hard part of it. Now, exceptions to this do happen. Morgana, for example, is a champion who got a visual design, who got a visual update, and very little changed about her kit to the point where you could be sort of forgiven for saying, well, nothing actually happened, right? She's the exact same person she was before. All that happened is, they changed these very small things. But Essentially, the problem is that, Riot had already committed to doing a dual VGU with her and Kale since forever ago. So all they did is say, well, if we're already going to be doing the VGU, is there anything we can do in her kit-wise while we're already in the lab? And essentially, they did end up giving her bonus movement speed towards champions while her R is active, but that was about it. And I would guess probably the same thing happened for Ezreal and his VGU, as Riot decided we want to VGU Ezreal, despite the fact that he still has very good gameplay, and he still does a lot of things we like. But while we're VGUing him, we may as well go ahead and do this update to his W to give that slightly better gameplay. So all in all, the essential reason why Riot don't do VGUs or VUs, I should say, is that it isn't worth their time. It's unfortunate, especially for players who really like the thematics of the characters and really want to see these characters live up to their, what they're supposed to be as much as possible. But at the very least, we can be content with updated appearances and things like Legends of Runeterra or the characters appearing in cinematics. Caitlyn's design in the Awakened cinematic, for example, or not Awakened cinematic, it was the Warrior cinematic, right? Like, that's way better than what we have in-game. That's a lot closer to what I would actually imagine Caitlyn looking like. But at the very least, I did get to see that in a Riot official production, right? Or something like Leona's appearance in Legends of Runeterra, right? Being able to look at her and say, okay, cool, she looks way better in this than she potentially does in-game. So while it is unfortunate that Riot don't get around to doing any of these things, essentially I can't fault them too much, as I do kind of think it makes sense from a standpoint for why they don't do more VUs. But either way, that's going to be it for me today, guys. Let me know what you think of any of this down in the comment section below, especially if you want to see more VUs. I hope this did enlighten you guys as to why they don't do more of it, but let me know what you guys think of any of this down in the comment section below. Would love to hear your thoughts. If you enjoyed today's video, go ahead and leave a like, and if you really enjoyed today's video, consider subscribing. I upload a video every Monday, Friday, and on patch days as well. Once again, thank you guys so very much for watching. I do appreciate it, and I'll talk to you all later.